Thank you to Jim and Avner for inviting me to participate. A special thanks to Avner for giving me a gentle nudge and encouragement for discussing this paper, which I was worried was written by two asset pricers and I would spend too much time on it. In fact, I spent far more time than I ever thought, largely because it's an incredibly interesting and thought-provoking paper. Also because my father's worked at MetLife for the last 25 years. And he found this paper particularly interesting, given that he doesn't find any of my papers interesting. We spent a lot of time talking about it. So I hope I can offer some constructive suggestions for Ralph and Moto. Okay. Here's the basic result and the story that I think. They're a little bit unclear on the story in the paper, but I think this is what they have in mind. The empirical result is striking, right? You have this massive drop in markups that happened in January of 2009. Okay, and so what I think is running in the background is the following. Insurers are facing a moral hazard problem. State guarantees incentivize excessive risk-taking that generate externalities borne by taxpayers. So the solution is regulation, and in particular capital requirements that limit this risk-taking. The problem is this regulation can distort incentives in certain states of the world. And what Ralph and Moto do is they conduct an experiment where they look at a shock to the balance sheet that happens as a result of the financial crisis. Capital constraints bind, and I put bind in quotes because they're not literally binding. What's going on is insurers are getting very close to losing credit ratings, which are incredibly valuable to them for a variety of reasons, some of which Ralph touched on implicitly. And ultimately, you see this alteration in the provision of insurance. Okay. This is a very familiar story to people in corporate finance. Instead of insurers, it's banks, and instead of state guarantees, it's the FDIC. And instead of insurance provision, we're talking about loan provision. This has been studied extensively for the last 15, 20 years. It starts, perhaps the closest paper are those by Peek and Rosengren. There's a host of others, and I apologize in advance to the many papers I've left off this list, just because it didn't fit. You can find links to other elements in the corporate literature, whether it's fire sales or financing constraints more broadly. But I think it's important to understand what's really new here, since it's not really the economic story per se. What's new is, first, it's the industry, and that is important. Insurance is a big component of the financial sector, almost a third, I think, according to Greenwood and Sharfstein. And I think the biggest contribution of this paper is what I'll call relatively clean estimates of the value implications. So for all these banking papers, we find changes in the provision of loans, but we don't really understand what the value implications, the actual dollar impacts are. Ralph and Moto have a setting in which they can plausibly, subject to some concerns raised during Ralph's presentation, where they can plausibly measure the marginal cost of the product and get at the dollar value that arises when these constraints bind. And that's really the key contribution of this paper. And so I'm going to spend a lot of time in my discussion focusing on thinking about the numbers that they're putting forth. Okay. All right. So when I looked at these pictures, aside from thinking they're quite striking, I had a couple of questions. The first question was, insurer losses on their portfolios of ABS and corporate bonds started happening in Q4 2007. They peaked in 2008. But the response really doesn't kick in until Q4 of 2008, and it doesn't happen fully until January of 2009. Okay? So, when you think of a fire sale, why are you going to wait to sell stuff when 3/4 of the house is already burnt down? Number one. And number two, why does it just happen, or why is it concentrated in just January, 1 month? Okay. Second, Ralph and Moto mentioned this in the paper, but don't really talk about it. What happened back here in 2001, 2002, when you had markups decline substantially, not as large as 2009, but still substantially? What's going on? Was that another balance sheet effect that happened as a result of the 2001 recession? Okay. So let me pose an alternative explanation, then I'll poke holes in my alternative explanation, then I'll offer a test to rule it out. Okay. I think that the price dip may not be about fire sales per se, or not entirely about fire sales, but rather there's a high price elasticity of demand in this market that's time varying. Two, there's time variation in competition, an extreme amount. And number 3, it turns out that new life tables were rolled out and adopted in the state of California, which is where their sample is, in January of 2009. Okay, so as I just mentioned, CSO 2001 mortality tables were rolled out and adopted in this state. Wait, we're not in California. Well, in California on January 1, 2009, meaning all insurers had to start using the new tables. What was in them? Well, first of all, people live longer, okay? That's going to reduce the cost of insurance that gets, at least in this market, gets passed on to the consumer in the form of lower prices. You're going to have a bigger impact for young people than old people, which will give you that heterogeneity. And the so-called loss on new policies is arguably offset to some extent by the gains on old policies that are now, in some sense, overpriced. Okay. Further, the price declines are amplified by the fact that this is a down market, okay? And there's enormous competition for market share in the insurance industry in this time, particularly in this period. But we actually saw something quite similar in 01-02 after the 2001 recession. The down market led to increased competition among surviving insurers, and in 03, you saw some ex post confirmation of this fact through an enormous amount of consolidation and exit in the industry. Okay. All right, so what's a problem with my alternative? Well, first of all, it holds for term annuities, which are completely decoupled from the mortality tables. So I don't have an explanation for that. But I think there's a very simple test here, because it turns out there's heterogeneity in the time periods in which states adopted the new mortality tables. Just look at another state, say Oklahoma in 04. If you see a similar price dip, you know your story's not the whole story, and you might even be able to back out the mortality effects by looking at the difference. I think it'll offer a nicer counterfactual than, say, the Great Depression, because the regulatory environment is virtually identical. But how do we reconcile this with their regression? Because they actually have a very nice and plausible source of exogenous variation. Okay. So you can think of their empirical analysis as really just a linear regression with markup on the left, an intercept, and then this is the V hat over VI, the reserve value per actuarial dollar. That's the thing that varies according to those formulas that Ralph showed you. It has nothing to do with demand. They were set a long time ago. So if that's truly exogenous, and I believe it is, how can this alternative story be playing a role? And I think the key is to look at the beta coefficient. Okay? That varies over insurer time, whereas the exogenous variation is over policy time. And the lambda that they're talking about, that number is buried in beta, right? It's buried back there in the beta. So if you want to think about identification threats and reconciling the alternatives that we might propose, it's going to come through latent variation in insurer time variables. So for example, if there's credit quality that's moving around over time, and we certainly think there was, competition or even lapsation, you can get some endogeneity that seeps into the identification of beta and alters the true magnitudes of the effects. So take credit qualities of insurers. First, state guarantees guarantee only $250 and $300K, which is little comfort to my wife, frankly. Further, 60% of the portfolios are held in investment-grade bonds, but as we know, bonds experienced a lot of downgrades over this period. In fact, ABS, of which 7 to 8% of insurer portfolios are invested in, many of those ABS actually went from AAA to junk in one step. So I'm not quite convinced that insurers are risk-free or akin to the US government. Further, the ratings, as Ralph mentioned, it matters to consumers. Okay? Consumers care whether or not their insurance company is going to be around to pay out. And so credit quality and financial health is really important in the product markets. Okay. Competition, we know that varies over time. It was most obvious in the 2003 shakeout I mentioned earlier. And as far as lapsation, which isn't addressed in the paper, you might think, actually I know, there's matching on income and wealth to insurers, which varies across insurance companies. And lapsation varies dramatically over time. You can imagine lapsation increases in down times. So you have to wonder how that's seeping into your beta estimate as well. Okay. One way to deal with some of these issues is to run a within insurer year regression, so the only variation is the exogenous variation. You're going to get noisy estimates of beta because I imagine you don't have an enormous amount of within observations, but you can certainly average across the betas and get some estimate. Okay. All right. The other thing I wondered is, what about cross-subsidization? Insurance companies offer multiple product lines beyond the ones you're looking at. I don't know if there's bundle pricing going on or not. You can speak more clearly to that. But the net effect on firm value, I think, is very unclear at this point. Okay? And then to a point raised by Chester, I don't understand the use of treasuries here. You should be using AAAs at best, I think. I just don't find the motivation, especially if you buy into some of Annette and Arvind's recent work. That points to this notion of a convenience yield embedded in the treasury rate. Another way you might want to think about life insurers, what they were doing during this, is they were altering their portfolios, especially in the life insurance sector, because they're subject to HCA, historical cost accounting. What they seem to be doing, according to a recent paper, is gains trading, which is another channel to get around the binding constraint, right? And one point that the authors don't touch on, and it's really for a different paper. Art, how are we doing? Good? 2 minutes, thanks. I think the far bigger issue here is really the variable annuities that were sold. Because the dip in prices that Ralph and Moto are identifying is important, but it's really just a short-term blip. The variable annuities that were sold are going to be problems for a very long time for these insurance companies. So let me just wrap up quickly and say this was a nice paper. I enjoyed it. I think with some more fleshing out, there's a lot to be learned. So thank you again.